So in 5.4, we'll talk about more about reproduction and how different cells reproduce. So today we'll talk about asexual reproduction, which means that it's just by one cell. So asexual reproduction only involves one cell. Sexual reproduction involves two cells. So many organisms just can divide on their own without any other cell involving the process. Generally, it's simple cells like bacteria that do this, or fungus, usually more complex cells. I mean, they don't divide to create new organisms this way, usually if they're complex. Like for us, humans can't divide on their own, but our cells can replace themselves through this process. So our blood cells, skin cells are all replaced in this division too. And so your blood cells will split to create more blood cells. Your skin cells do the same thing. But to reproduce totally, to make a whole new organism, only certain ones do this, like bacteria and fungus. Some others do it that are more complex. We'll talk about that too in this chapter. So reproduction, when I'm talking about it in this sense, it means to make a whole new organism. And you can have it arise from one parent or two parents. So sexual reproduction involves two parents. Asexual reproduction involves just one parent, one cell, making two cells.
Just out of curiosity, so I've heard of some plants that have the option of reproducing either or.
Yes, so some can do that, yes. Also, some animals can do that. Yeah, some like jellyfish can do that.
Well, as far as animals go, jellyfish are kind of the breeds. They have no organs.
I mean, they do. I mean, they're not very complex, but they do. I mean, they have different body parts, right?
It doesn't have a brain,
Yeah.
doesn't have a heart.
No, they don't have those things. That's right. But they have skin. They have an eye type area. They have tentacles. They have nervous system, right? I mean, so in that sense,
If it doesn't have a brain, it'll make the question, is it even conscious life?
no, it's not conscious. That's true. I mean, it's not like, a dog or a dolphin as far as consciousness goes, and definitely not like a human. But it can feel pain. Now, in a sense, how is it pain compared to a dog's pain or a human's pain? We're not quite sure, but it definitely does have instincts that it can choose to do certain things, right?
So where are the instincts stored in the brain?
In the nervous system. Basically, it's chemical reactions to things. It's not a conscious.
And I think there was a question right.
But think about like chemistry, right? I mean, if you take a match and you strike the match, it's going to light on fire, right? Well, is the match choose to light on fire? No. I mean, it's just a chemical reaction to going on, right? In response to what you're doing. Well, that's also what some primitive animals do as well. It's a chemical response to something that's going on.
Mhm.
It's not a conscious decision. It's unconscious chemical reaction.
So is a jellyfish kind of like a robot?
Yeah, I mean, you can think of it that way. Like simple animals, you could think of as robots because they don't have, even like a dog and a dolphin. In some sense, I don't know how much free will you could say a dog or a dolphin has, because I mean they can choose certain things, but they're very much bound by instinct too. But animals like dogs and dolphins have feelings. They can be sad. Dogs can be depressed. They are happy. It just depends on the situation, but they can change their mood based on what's going on around them. So in that sense, they are sentient because they can respond to the environment. They can sense how you're feeling. They can respond to your feelings. They have feelings too. Now, is it human feelings? No, it's not as complex or deep as a human feels, but they definitely do have emotions and they feel pain. So it's a very different level from, say, a dog feeling pain than, say, a grasshopper feeling pain, because the grasshoppers do have a nervous system and even a primitive brain, but grasshoppers are not going to cry. A dog can cry. And so it is a very different level of feeling going from, say, an insect to an animal like a dog. And jellyfish too are more like an insect like than like a dog like. There's gradations in the animal kingdom as far as how complex they are. And jellyfish are very primitive. They don't really have much of a brain. They don't really, so they don't think, but dogs can think about, I mean, they have dreams. Dogs, they have emotions like they have love and affection for their owners. So they have a wide range of emotions that other animals don't have. So it just depends on the kind of animal you're talking about, but there is a wide range of complexities to animals based on their brains and how complex their brains are. Binary fission, we'll talk about first. It's similar to mitosis. So I know it's been a while since we talked about mitosis, but mitosis, remember, it's how one cell divides into two cells. So one cell becomes two identical cells in mitosis. And that's how your body replaces its cells. So whether it's a blood cell, a skin cell, a fat cell, I mean, if it's replacing a cell in your body, that cell undergoes mitosis to make more of its own kind. This is like mitosis, but the difference is that in binary fission, you're making a new organism. You're not just making a new cell. That new cell is a new organism. So it's the creation of an offspring from a single parent. So this would be bacteria or fungus when it's a single-celled organism. And when that cell divides, it creates two organisms. There are two cells that live on their own. Your blood cells are not organisms. Take out one blood cell from your body, what happens? That blood cell dies. It's not an organism. It doesn't live on its own. But a yeast cell can live on its own. And so it's its own living being. And so that's an organism compared to a body cell. So this is binary fission, where you have two daughter cells that are genetically identical to the parent cells. Basically, it's like a clone or a twin. The cells are identical to each other. And so we talk about human cloning, which has never happened, but if it were to happen, you would be basically doing this, where you'd be making your own twin. It'd be the same exact genes as you. And that's what twins are too. Identical twins have the same exact genes. And they are clones of each other. Now, even identical twins, though, do look a little bit different because there is more than just genes that make you you. You have your own soul, you have your own choices that you make, and those are going to shape who you are, and it will change a little bit on how you look and how you develop over time. Same thing with these cells, too. So even though bacterial cells make clones of each other, they can, over time, look and act differently. They can get mutations. The DNA can make mistakes, which can also make them have different characteristics. What's the red stuff inside these cells right here? Yeah, DNA, exactly, very good. So that's, in a bacterial cell, we don't see nuclei. We don't see a nucleus in a bacterial cell. DNA is just scattered all throughout the cell. And so this is a prokaryotic cell, which has DNA just all jumbled up with no organelles, no nucleus. We already did all that. Just the very bottom bullet point here you need to write down. Binary fission occurs in prokaryotes. So prokaryote would be a bacterial cell where the DNA is not in a nucleus. It's just all throughout the cell. It's a very simple cell, very small cell, not much to it besides just having DNA and ribosomes inside it. Binary fission and mitosis have similar results. In both cases, you do make two cells at the end that are identical to each other. So that's how they're similar. They both produce two cells at the end that are copies of each other. Oh, sorry, I was lost on here. This happens sometimes where I just go too far, I can't get back to it. Let me escape from this, go back. Okay, here we are. Okay, so while in both cases we do have two cells at the end that are the same, the actual process to get from a parent cell to the daughter cells is different. And so it's a different process to go through binary fission compared to mitosis. They don't look the same. You have different steps in both cases. You don't have anaphase, telophase, metaphase in binary fission like you do in mitosis. We don't see the chromosomes in X shapes and pulling apart like we see in mitosis. Oh, sorry, I don't know why it does this when I get to that part, but it doesn't stay on that bullet point. Try and go back again. Hopefully it'll stay. So we had, let's see, we were right here, weren't we? Did you all get that down?
No.
Okay. I'll just keep it right here for now so it doesn't go forward. So the difference between the two is that in binary fission, it occurs in prokaryotes without a nucleus. And that's the big difference between mitosis and binary fission. It's where it happens. And in binary fission, we see it only in prokaryotes. And in mitosis, it keeps on doing this. I just need to keep it without a slideshow for right now. So binary fission, we only see in prokaryotes. In mitosis, we only see that in eukaryotes with the nucleus. So that's one of the big differences between the two. Is what kind of cells do we see undergoing this division? So in binary fission, it's only prokaryotes, which are only bacterial cells. Mitosis occurs in eukaryotes, which would be plants, animals, fungus, everything except bacteria. Another reason would be, or another difference would be the purpose for the two. Mitosis is to replace your cells if they're damaged or dying, or to repair an injury. So you undergo mitosis to grow or to repair an injury. Binary fission is to make more organisms. So in humans, animals, and plants, mitosis is to help grow that plant, animal, or human. It's to repair any injuries. Binary fission happens in things like bacteria to make more bacteria. But each bacteria is its own separate organism. Okay, let's move on to why an organism might undergo different kinds of reproduction. So the environment determines what reproduction type is the best for that organism, whether it's asexual reproduction, which is just one organism on its own, making more of its own kind, or sexual reproduction, where you need to have two organisms, two parents, to make an offspring. So in a stable environment where you have no changing conditions, it's best for things to reproduce asexually, which means that it's one organism making duplicates of itself. Every new organism is the same as the parent. It's the same exact genes every time, which makes sense if you have an environment that's consistent. You don't want the genes to change, because if you have different genes, well, you might have worse conditions for that organism. Now, if you think about, say a polar bear up north, it wants white fur. White fur gives it an advantage because white fur is camouflaged with the snow. And it can catch prey more easily if it has white fur. If you have a black bear up north, it's going to have a hard time surviving in that environment because a black bear will stand out and it won't be able to catch prey. And so if you have conditions like the Arctic where it's always snowy, you don't want to have different genes. You don't want different colors on the fur if you're a bear. You just want white fur. So you have conditions that are constant. You want the genes to stay constant too. And so that would favor reproduction that's asexual in those conditions where you have just copies of the parent's genes with no changes at all in the genes. So if you have good genes that are well suited to the environment, then changing the genes would be more harmful than helpful. And so it's better to just have the same genes for every organism than to have different kinds of genes if you have a good gene for the environment. Oh, sorry, I'm gonna go back. And so there are certain animals and plants that can choose to undergo both kinds of reproduction at different times. Even things like worms can sometimes do this. Jellyfish, as I mentioned, can also undergo both reproduction types. So it depends upon their environment, which one they're going to be doing. Whether they make more copies of their own kind, or if they have combinations of genes to make different kinds of traits in their offspring. So reproduction sexually would be when you have two parents having different traits combining to have an offspring which has a combinations of those two traits. And that would mean you're going to have different kinds of offspring. You're going to have a wide variety of traits if you reproduce sexually, because you have a lot of mixing of genes, a lot of different variety of traits in that case. So variance in genes would increase a chance of having a favorable gene. If you have changing conditions in the environment, then this is helpful. If you don't have the same conditions, then this would help you find good traits that helps you survive in a different kind of environment. Now, some bacteria have found a way to kind of cheat and do both, even though they really don't. So bacteria reproduce only asexually, where it's just one bacteria makes more of its own kind, where it's just an exact copy of itself. But bacteria can still find ways to get different traits. And so we don't know how they do this exactly, but somehow one bacteria can sense that another bacteria does not have a trait that it needs, like to get immunity to antibiotics. It can just sense in some way that its neighbor does not have the immunity to antibiotics, and it can make a tunnel and transfer that gene to that bacteria. And so now both are immune to the antibiotics. And so they can transfer genes that way, where it's not reproduction, but they can transfer genes to give them different traits. So when a bacteria does reproduce, it's reproducing asexually, where that one bacteria just makes a copy of itself, but they can get different genes by swapping genes afterwards. An advantage to reproducing asexually is that each organism can reproduce on its own. And so you can get a lot of new organisms very quickly. You don't need to find male and female partners to make an offspring. Each one can make its own offspring by itself. And so it can reproduce a lot faster that way. And so bacteria reproduce very quickly because each cell can reproduce on its own. But reproducing sexually would involve a male and a female, where you only have half the organisms reproducing because only the mother would carry the baby to term, and you'd only would have one offspring from two parents. Instead of in asexual reproduction, where each one produces a new offspring on its own. So it takes more time. You have less offspring reproducing sexually, and they need to find a mate. They need to male and female have to match up, and that takes time and energy. And so that means you're going to have less population growth in those conditions than you would if each one makes a baby on its own, like you see with bacteria and fungus. And so bacteria reproduce incredibly quickly. About every 20 minutes, it can make a new bacterial cell. So bacteria would take over the world if you had enough nutrients for it, and very, very quickly, because it can grow out of control very fast, but it limits its growth due to limiting its nutrients, oxygen, and space. But grown unchecked, bacteria could overtake everything very fast in a day or two. So eukaryotes sometimes can reproduce asexually through mitosis. And an example of that would be, if I can get this picture up here and show it to you. So an example would be budding, which we saw in the yeast. For those who were here last week, we saw the yeast cells make more of their own kind. It's the very bottom picture. You can see this yellow orange picture, where one yeast cell makes a new yeast cell. And we call that budding because it's a new organism that is on the parent. It's smaller and it grows until it falls off the parent, and then it's its own organism. More complex organisms like Hydra can also do this. So Hydra is microscopic, but it's a small animal like a jellyfish. It's very similar to a jellyfish, it's microscopic. It has tentacles. Its mouth is by the tentacles. I don't have my pointer on here, so I can't show it, but its mouth is right here, where it pulls food into it and eats it through there. And so a hydra can form a new organism right here, where these are the little babies that are forming off of it. And they'll grow and then fall off the parent. So examples of that would be hydra and yeast that can reproduce through budding, which would be a clone. It's a twin. It has the same exact genes as the parent because it's asexual reproduction. It's reproducing itself entirely a copy of the parent. Another way animals can reproduce asexually is through fragmentation. So there's certain kinds of animals that reproduce when they're cut. Starfish is one of the best examples of that. You can cut off the arm of a starfish. You can see right here, this is just one arm that was cut off right here. That one arm, though, is now growing all these other arms. And eventually it will then be full size again. So one arm off a starfish can regenerate itself into a full starfish. Worms can do this too, to a certain extent. Depends on kind of worm. Earthworms can somewhat do this. But one worm can do this incredibly well. It's called planaria. It's a flatworm. That's what you're seeing right here in this picture. This is a planaria right here. It's in different steps of reproduction. But it can split on its own. And so when it wants to make more of its own kind, it just splits them down the middle. As you can see right here, it's just splitting apart. And this eventually turns into this, and it just splits more and more until you have two worms that are clones of each other. So that's one way they can reproduce. Another way they can reproduce is just if you were to cut them. You can see right here on the right-hand side, if you were to just cut off this guy's head, that head would grow back into a worm. Tail, the same thing. So you can make very small cuts to this worm. Each little cut grows into a whole new worm.
If you cut like the middle, would that make any
It would. You can take this guy and cut it 279 times. And each little cut would grow into a new worm. So take one worm and cut it 279 times, and each little piece would grow into a new worm.
Is it possible that like we could somehow like I don't know, transfer those genes that makes it possible to do that to a normal like worm in one of your garden?
That's a really good question. They're hoping to do that someday. I bet they're looking into that. Not just for worms, but for us. Like maybe we can regenerate too that way. Not to make babies that way. That's really weird. But to just if we like had our arm cut off to regrow our arm. We're hoping to have that someday. And that we're looking at Planaria to help learn how to do that. Yeah, so someday we might be able to do that. Like not just for worms in a garden, but also for us. But we're not there just yet, but probably in the next decade or so, I would imagine we will get to that point where we can do that.
So like with your arms, like what will you?
Well, if you use the Planaria's genes, yes. And so if you basically, if you're like a Planaria, cut off your finger, that would grow into a whole new you, where it would be your twin, not just a new body, but you. It would be your twin. I mean, that'd be so weird to think about. But that every, like, cut off your arm, cut off your finger, cut off your nose, each part would grow into a whole new you, and it would be your exact copy of yourself. That's what Planaria does. So it's an incredible organism that it can do this. It's the best at doing this of any animal. These guys are very small though. They're about like 2 millimeters usually. They're not usually more than an inch at most. They're usually much less than an inch, but at most an inch long. Earthworms don't do this to the same extent, but earthworms to a smaller extent can regenerate parts of their body. But they don't make new worms. They just can regrow or regenerate injured parts of their body. And then certain plants can also regenerate. And so you can take a stem from a certain plant, and that stem can grow a whole new plant. Strawberries, potatoes are good at doing this. Not every plant can do this, but certain plants can regenerate from a small part of the parent plant.
If my mom would get flowers or something, she always cut off the top and put the very bottom of it, and so she goes inside.
Oh yeah, that's a good idea. And yeah, so a lot of plants you can do things like that. Other plants you can't, just depends. But when they do that, it's regeneration. That it's regenerating the parts that are cut off, like the roots or the stems or the leaves. I usually get Planaria and have you all do this for yourself. So I didn't do that yet. So I need to go and do that for you all so you can see what it looks like. Because I have every student look at the Planaria and cut them and watch them grow back. It takes about a week to grow back. And it's not, I mean, these are very small worms. They're not like earthworms. You don't see blood or guts or anything like that. I mean, they don't have a blood system. They don't have organs like other worms have. And so it's a very clean cut. It's not gross. They don't feel pain because they don't have a brain. So it's not cruel to do this because they don't feel pain. It's natural for them to do this because they will regrow, they'll regenerate this way on their own.
Is that why they can regenerate? Because they don't have, like, they only have their DNA?
They're very simple. That's right. I mean, they do have little eye type things. I mean, you can see right here that these look like eyes, but they're not true eyes. They're eye spots, which means they can see light and dark. That's about it. They can't see things like we see them. So they're very primitive, very simple. They don't really have a full digestive system. They just have a tube that sucks in food, but they don't have a mouth to eat. They have a suction cup that pulls in food. And so they can't chew, so they're very, very simple creatures and they're very small. So they're not like other kinds of worms that have a mouth, that have a brain, like that have hearts. They don't have any of that.
What happens if you eat one?
Yeah, I mean, you could. I mean, they might have bacteria and then that can make you sick, but
They die? Like,
oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, if you grind them up, they're gonna die. So cutting them won't kill them, but smashing or grinding will kill them.
what if you like swallow it?
Just swallow it whole.
Yeah.
It would survive. I mean, the acid in your stomach eventually would kill it,
Oh,
but it would survive for a little bit of time. But the acid, they can't survive that.
what do they eat?
They eat basically just little food particles like bacteria, bits, anything that is just broken up because they can't chew. And so it's small bacteria or algae or just fragments of animals that have already died. So many animals and plants can reproduce both sexually and asexually. I mentioned jellyfish, they can do this. They have 2 life cycles. A sea anemone is like a jellyfish upside down, and they can do this too. So a sea anemone is basically it's jellyfish that's not mobile. It's basically a plant-like jellyfish. It stays on the seafloor. So a sea anemone can reproduce in many different ways. So this is where clownfish live. You know, it looks like a plant, but it's an animal. It stays in place. It has tentacles. It has a mouth. It brings food in. So it can reproduce by budding, where it can break off pieces from itself. And either it can reproduce by fragmenting, where pieces just fall off and it makes more of its own kind, or it can have this, where it makes a little bud that then creates more sea anemones. So either you have a fragment off the parent, or this then makes more offspring off of it that then fall off. So this is just an immature sea anemone. It's just a smaller version of this. So those are asexual reproduction, where it reproduces by fragmenting or by budding. Sexual reproduction would involve eggs and sperm, where it would just send out eggs and sperm into the water to be fertilized. So asexual reproduction would be involving making its twin, where it's just the same exact thing. Sexual would involve more than one anemone, where you'd have different variants and traits. So a stable environment, it would reproduce asexually. If it's not a stable environment, it would reproduce sexually and have different kinds of traits. So it can reproduce sexually by making eggs and sperm, in which case you would need a mother and a father plant to then combination of genes to make different kinds of offspring. So they're really amazing creatures. Only clownfish can live inside sea anemones because it stings everything else, including humans. Sea anemones have a chemical that stings other animals and humans, but it can sense, an anemone can sense a clownfish, and it will not sting the clownfish because they have different kinds of chemicals that allow them to go into the sea anemone and live there. And so clownfish are protected because it will sting anything else besides the clownfish. The anemones like clownfish to be there because the anemones can't really move around to get food, but the clownfish bring food to it. The clownfish brush against the anemone, and by brushing against them, they give off, they have little bacteria, algae, fragments from the ocean that are food for the anemone that just fall off into the mouth. And so they get fed by the clownfish. All right, so that's it for 5.4.